Bush period 6 review. What is this? 1860 something? What is this? 18? What do I got? 1865 to 1898. All right. All right. So we are recording. Got the little red light up there. We are recording. So we're going to talk about period 6, our unit 5, which is pretty much we're talking about the end of Reconstruction. We know the Reconstruction, the Compromise of 1877 is part of this whole idea of Reconstruction, or the end of Reconstruction. Why is the Compromise of 1877 essentially the end of Reconstruction? Because they made a whole deal. Yeah, they made a deal. That's a compromise. Yeah, the Republicans and Democrats struck a deal, because in the '76 election there was no clear-cut majority leader of the winner of electoral votes. So they struck a deal, and the deal was essentially, um, the Democrats will vote in the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes as long as Reconstruction ended. So we will see the end of Reconstruction with that deal. In order, Reconstruction ends just to get a Republican in the White House, and then the Republicans will pull back their military control of the South, and the Democrats were going to go back to in the South back to ruling themselves politically. Okay, so pretty much from that point on through to let's say McKinley, what is our government, our federal government, for the most part practicing? What kind of idea is our federal government practicing? Laissez-faire, yeah, laissez-faire ideas. And what does this do, this idea of laissez-faire approach, what does it do for industry? What does it do for industry? Anyone know? What does it do for industry, this laissez-faire approach? We will get a booming industries. We will see the growth of monopolies. We'll see the growth of trusts. We will see essentially that the growth of big businesses kind of ruling and controlling the government. What does it put? Allowed them to bully people, like big business trusts. Yeah, that's exactly what we'll see. Okay, so we see this growth, and it won't be until the end of the century where we start to see this progressive movement that kind of starts with the populist party and the populist movement, that we'll talk about towards the end of today's discussion. Okay, so some things that happened during this time period. We know that we've been practicing manifest destiny, and we've been spreading west. We had the Trail of Tears in the 1830s, and pretty much we have broken every rule or every agreement we've made with the indigenous people. We keep taking their land, and we keep moving westward, and the manifest destiny idea is growing. We know we had the Kansas Nebraska Act to get more states so that we can eventually create the railroad. We will see during this time period the golden spike is driven that creates the Transcontinental Railway. So we're bringing democracy in our government and our ideologies from the east all the way across the west. Now, during that time, we're going to see some travesties. We know under Abe Lincoln will actually execute or legitimize a mass execution of indigenous people up in Minnesota. Over 20 people will be hung, or 20 indigenous people will be hung for fighting with American residents that are living there. But we also see another example of the Sand Creek Massacre. The Sand Creek Massacre. Now that happens. The Sand Creek Massacre. Holy cow, happens. Yep, happens in 1864. The Sand Creek Massacre happens in Colorado, and we're going to see some indigenous people that are being threatened out there in Colorado. So they go to the federal, like post, the fort of the federal government, and said, "Hey, please protect us." And they go, "Sure, hang out by there's a clearing by the Sand Creek, so you'll be safe there." But what we're going to see happen is the governor of Colorado is actually going to send some Colorado volunteers there to essentially slaughter the indigenous people. Now, here's what happens: the indigenous people feel that they're safe being guarded by the federal government, but it turns out, the men go away to hunt and gather and get food for their families, and while they're gone, uh, the volunteers come and they slaughter the women and children. So this is what, once again, we see that this Sand Creek massacre was rooted in this idea of this conflict of us heading west and taking over the land out west, that whole manifest destiny. So this is another action that is demonstrates America's aggressiveness and people's aggressiveness to head westward. Now, eventually, we'll sign the Fort Laramie Treaty, which we essentially say we're giving indigenous people a certain amount of land. Things will be theirs. You're protected. Okay, we won't do this anymore. We promise not to do this anymore. Um, Unfortunately, that's not going to happen, right? Unfortunately, that's not going to happen. We see things up at Little Bighorn. We see there is what is discovered up there in the Dakotas. What do we discover in the Dakotas that changes things again up in that region? That's right. We find gold. All right, Christoph, we find gold. Um, and once again, this leads to Custer's last stand. This leads to this battle, this slaughtering of indigenous people. Um, and so, once again, another example of America's indiscretions towards the indigenous people. Then we see Chief Joseph up in the Northwest in the Nez Perce. Once again, he goes to Congress and gives this famous speech that we will fight no more from here on in. We won't fight anymore. They're tired. Yeah. So once again, we see kind of the breaking of the indigenous people, because they just can't compete with the military might of America. We see the growth of indigenous people going to reservations. Um, and we see, in the reservations, the indigenous people are not getting what they're being promised. Our government says, "Hey, if you go to reservations, we'll feed you, we'll give you things, we'll help you." But once again, our government comes up short and doesn't provide those things. So you'll see rebellion in the reservations. And then you're taking tribes that were rivals and putting them in the same reservation. Okay. Yeah, and then eventually, towards the end of this whole century of dishonor, or this endless fighting of with indigenous people, we're actually going to passed this Dawes Act, and this Dawes Act is actually a law that's put in place that is trying to force indigenous people to assimilate to the American ideology. You know, the old kill the Indian, save the man, right? Kill the Indian, save the man. Take away their their culture and make them civilized into the what a American is. So we see that with the Dawes Act. Now, eventually, that will be taken away during the Great Depression. But by that time, you're talking about a whole generation has passed, and so a lot of their their history has been lost. Okay. Now we know we've looked and we've read a part of Helen Hunt Jackson's book, A Century of Dishonor, which she just talks about the ending of the culture of indigenous people and forcing them to assimilate and convert to Christianity. Okay. As we are essentially destroying the indigenous people's culture and lives and taking their land, we are moving out west. Okay, we're moving out west, and we get farmers and ranchers, and there's conflict between farmers and ranchers. We see the growth of the railroad, and a lot of people say that this, eventually our frontier will be closed. And we talked about too at the World's Fair. The Frederick Jackson Turner talks about this frontier eventually closing, but can we go further? So eventually we will see the ideas of our manifest destiny go beyond our borders, beyond the Pacific. And that's where we start to see a lot of American imperialism starting to develop. America will get more involved in Latin America. We'll pass the open door policy. When we start talking about Asia, we'll have the war with the Philippines. We'll have or the war in the Philippines, we'll have the Spanish American War. So once our frontier has closed, in theory, we're going to go on and we're going to go further. Remember, we are industrializing at this point, and to industrialize, we need raw materials. So we need places to get our raw materials. A lot of countries' wealth is considered their natural resources, what they have. And when our frontier is closed, we only have then that limited amount of goods. So we want to go further to get raw materials and resources. Plus, we want to have places to sell our finished goods. So we will start to lead towards the next part of or the next era of our country. Okay. So that leads us to big businesses, right? The booming society, right? The whole idea of monopolies, okay, in the Industrial Revolution. We're mass producing things. And we see these growth of robber barons, okay? Carnegie, Gould, Rockefeller. These are some of the J.P. Morgan are some of the robber barons of this time period. And these are some of the richest men in the world. And they are essentially using their monopolistic powers to charge higher prices, produce less goods, but to control the market. Okay. Now, many of them believe in this idea of social Darwinism. What is social Darwinism? Anyone? Anyone? Social Darwinism? Survival of the fittest, good, okay. And like only the strong survive, right? This idea of only the strong survive. So, when we think of social Darwinism, there's survival of the fittest, right? The wealth is in the hands of the fittest people, right? And people who are this idea of social Darwinism, the people who are poor are less fit, right? That's kind of the idea behind social Darwinism, that only the strong survive, and the people who are wealthy are the people that are the fittest. Okay. Now, a lot of people get these three, the gospel of wealth and the social gospel, people get these mixed up a little bit. Okay. So we've got social Darwinism. What about the gospel of wealth? What is the gospel of wealth? The responsibility of philanthropy. Absolutely. This gospel of wealth is this idea. We've talked about religion and how important religion is, and wealthy people like Carnegie, though they're really wealthy, they feel that there's a certain amount of responsibility, a God-given responsibility, to give some sort of civic philanthropy back. So instead of me just giving you money to, like, if you're poor, instead of me just handing you money, which you might turn around and just waste it and still be in poverty, we're going to pay for things to create the tools that will help you become skilled or educated to become wealthier, to get out of poverty. So we're not giving, this gospel wealth is not, we're not just giving handouts. Okay. God, Rockefeller said that God gave me riches, right? He gave him riches, but then what is his duty with those riches? And a lot of these philanthropists, and you could say like Bill Gates, is one of those where they're giving a lot of money back to research, to education, to help infrastructures of countries and the well-being of society, but just not handing out, handouts. Now, the social gospel is a little bit different. The social gospel, we'll see that as part of the progressive movement a little bit. What is the social gospel? The social gospel. Anyone? Yeah. Like of the public ideas. Well, the the social gospel is, it's kind of a church-based idea where the Protestants are hardworking, and we know under the gospel of wealth, Protestants are hardworking. That's kind of a stereotype or a characteristic of a Protestant, and we know during the this gilded age, we see this conspicuous consumption. We're showing off wealth and people are really rich, and we're going to see the social gospel kind of leads to the ideas of muckrakers, that we are trying to, the social gospel, the church is trying to unfold and show people the problems that are happening in society, showing the social problems, the crime, the poverty stricken neighborhoods, and that it is our spiritual duty to help fix those things, to attack these problems. And our religion should do that. If we're spiritual people and we have good morals, um, so our morals should be getting us, like, today, if we believed in the social gospel and we are church going people, if you, and then once again, I'm not saying you are or aren't, but if you are one of those people, what are you doing to help solve the situations that are happening in society, the negative things that are happening in society? So the social gospel is more of a religious spin of your moral duty to fix problems that are happening in society, of poverty, of alcohol abuse, and that's why we'll see the temperance movement boil up again at this time period. We'll see the temperance movement boil up, the right for women's rights. We will see the right for fixing tenement housing. A lot of that is based on the social gospel or the principles of the social gospel. And like I said, this is kind of the beginning of the progressive era. Okay. Now, when we think of this time period, there's some problems. Okay. We know that our we have our industry is expanding exponentially. To support that, we are practicing our manifest destiny on steroids. We're starting to politically get involved in other countries. We're taking advantage of raw materials and resources, not really being considerate of the ramifications of the environment. Our government has, for the most part, been pretty laissez faire at this point. We don't really talk about a lot of presidents at this time. Our legislative branch is pretty much in the pockets of big businesses. We know we have awful working conditions and living conditions. We have latchkey kids, kids where mom and dad are working. You got little kids living on the streets. So you're going to see, and in cities, growing crime rate of young people doing things. Even little kids are forced to work into factories because they have small hands, or they're working in coal mines. Unions, a lot of times people are going to say unions are un-American. We will see that idea will change, especially when we get to the Great Depression. But a lot of people will say unions are un-American. Um, and once again, people are living in shanties. People are living in tenement housing. It's almost like people are living in dorms. Entire families are living in dorms, and they're all going outside to use a public bathroom. There's not clean water. You see pandemics develop. You see sickness and all that kind of stuff happening. We also eventually see the poor working conditions for meat. Does any remember a book we talked about where it was poor working conditions in the meatpacking plant? Yeah, the Upton Sinclair in the Jungle. And remember, that book was originally written to talk about the poor working conditions. But when Teddy Roosevelt read it and was like, "Oh my God, this is the food I'm eating," so that eventually led to the one of the progressive movements of the FDA. We Yeah, that's a pretty good movie too. The Gangs of New York is a good movie, Miss Fairmark. I like that one. What is that? Daniel Day Lewis is in there, um, right? And Daniel Day Lewis, one of the main characters in there. It's a pretty good movie. But then once again, we see the growth of social Darwinism. We see racism growing more and more and more. We know we have black codes. Eventually, by the end of this time period, we will see the Plessy versus Ferguson court case in the 1890s, a separate but equal. We see this racism is we're against immigrants, which leads to the nativism. We start to see more immigrants coming from different regions of war torn areas or areas of poverty. So we won't see as many people come from Western Europe. We'll start to see more Central and Eastern and Southern Europe. We'll start to see that. Now, in the last 50 or 60 years, we've seen in our history, just thinking it's 2020 now, so pretty much since World War II has ended, we've seen immigration change quite a bit more. We see far less Europeans coming to America since World War II, and more people from Asia, Africa, and Latin America than ever before. Okay, where people from those three regions weren't really coming to America, we saw more Europeans at this point. But we still have nativism, that hatred for immigrants. All right, so these are problems that we're dealing with. Um, International business expansions. We have to, if we want to internationally trade, we need a strong navy to protect our trade. And then once, yeah, and we that'll eventually lead to the Great White Fleet by Teddy Roosevelt, and then women's rights. Women still do not have the right to vote. Women still are given they're second class citizens, though they have been doing their civic duties at home and giving their kids information and educating their children. they're still not heard. We won't see until after World War One that women finally get a right to be heard with voting. Okay, so those are major conflicts of this time period. Okay, now it's 12 o'clock. We'll end this here and we'll finish up tomorrow. But just by your comments here in a second, Ms. Fehrenbacher and I were going to take a couple AP practice exams, just the multiple choice portion, and maybe even the written portions with no answers to anything, and post them on uh, Google on our Google Classrooms for you to take a look at and to read. And then maybe a day later we'll post the actual answers to the multiple choice, just as a way to kind of make you go back and reflect on um, your test to see how well you're doing. Is that something that some of you would be interested, that you would take the time to read through the 50-55 multiple choice questions? And we could just give you the straight answers of, A, B, C, D, but they also give us another document that is, it gives the A, B, C, D, but it actually goes through the rationale of each and every answer, why an answer is right or wrong. But that, once again, I think if there's 55 questions, I think it's 55 pages, because they do one answer per page on those answer keys. And then we can also give you the written portions that they've given, so that you could read them and kind of like go back and think, what do I need to know? Um, and to get you thinking and to kind of, self evaluate what you know. And then we can give you the summary of what the AP College Board said would be good answers, or things you could use to answer those written portions. So, I mean, I'm not going to go through all the, yeah, and cut them and paste them and cut them and paste them if none of you are going to look at it. But if you're going to look at them, we'll go ahead and we'll do that for you guys. All right, it'll be like a PDF, and we'll put it on Google Classroom, and then you turn around from there, and then we'll put it on. We can put it on the web page under review. We can put like on the last page of review, maybe uh, practice exams or something like that too. Okay. Is that something that people will do? I just got two people that said, yeah. Johnny, twice now. You're Johnny. You're like in Chicago. You're voting to multiple times here. Okay. All right. So we'll go ahead and, of course, Cody passed because he knows everything, right? Yeah. Well, he's got to go outside and cut the grass. Okay. All right. Well, then I'll go ahead and I'll stop the recording.